Hi, and welcome to another edition of my channel about Bitcoin. Tonight we have JW Weatherman, who I am a big fan of, which most people probably have seen on Twitter. JW, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is going to be fun.
I think so. So as a tradition, in the beginning of the show, I ask people I interview if they believe that there will be a time where Bitcoin sucks in all monetary value, so there will only be Bitcoin as money. Some people call it hyper-Bitcoinization. I like that word. I know you don't. We may not have time to discuss why, but do you think this is the case? And if yes, when would that be?
Let's see. I do think that that's the case, and I'm gonna go with 2028. I'm gonna give it 10 years.
Wow. Okay. Cool. But hey, yeah, at least you believe it happens. I'm actually becoming even more aggressive since yesterday, and that's after looking at. There was one tweet today. I don't remember who was showing it, but it's pretty clear that that Bitcoin blow off top keeps coming approximately 1.5 years after every halving. And the next halving is going to be around the I think start of 2020. It's going to move forward to the start of 2020, I believe. Then 1.5 years after that will be in 2022. So for the sake of Bitcoin, I'm pretty optimistic. I think that will be the top, where it will be so violent and so apparent, and everyone will kind of like start to understand it, so that there will be no selling off. It'll just continue and take over. But
yeah,
all right,
I think it's very possible, man. Yeah, I think it's very possible.
Cool. All right, thanks for your guesstimation. Before we get started, I want to give a shout out to our sponsor, mathbot.com, which is a website that you started, and me and a couple of other guys are contributing to that project. And the reason I personally chose to do that is it totally hits two of my big passions. One of them obviously being Bitcoin, which will be the only payment solution on the website. So helping Mathbot becoming a success will ultimately help Bitcoin, at least one day closer to the hyper-Bitcoinization event. In my point of view, Lightning Network will be the only payment solution on Mathbot. The other thing it really hits a home run on with me is the fact that it will let any kid or adult around the world learn math for free and programming by playing a game in a way where it's the stick of the normal school system, where you get low grades and you're constantly being told that you're not necessarily good. I mean, at least for that part of the the kids in school that don't necessarily get high grades, but they learn in Mathbot through their own speed and are challenged at the level they are at, and then they can actually go all the way up to sophomore level in university, which is the first year of university. The only time payment comes into this is if parents realize that it's hard to motivate kids to play the game, and then they could choose to motivate the kids by donating in Bitcoin through Lightning Network, and then the kids can earn 90% of that back as they pass through the more than 200 levels that I believe that there's going to be in the end. So I think that's fantastic. Good job to you on starting that.
Thanks, man. Thanks for all the help too. Yeah, I think we've got a little over 40 levels out now. So we'll probably end up with closer to 400 than 200. But maybe closer to 800. We'll see. We've got a long way to go to get through calculus, but yeah, the last levels cover recursive functions, which is kind of a pretty advanced topic. Real programmers struggle with writing recursive functions. So Yeah, it's going well, and no, thanks in no small part to you.
Well, thank you, thank you. It's my joy to work on that. I probably should be off somewhere in a corporation and making a fixed income, but I tend to instead choose to work on my passions. That costs, unfortunately, but it's so worthwhile. I think it's a good decision. Anyways,
Me too, but it's not free.
no, it's not free, but we're having fun. Anyways, so the reason that I thought it would be very interesting, I mean, you put a lot of statements out that, or you say a lot of things on your channel, which, by the way, I recommend everyone to listen to, and you can follow JW Weatherman below in the show notes. That challenge the way that I maybe used to think. At the same time, I'm quite open to the fact that the current system is dysfunctional. That was the entire reason that I came across Bitcoin in earlier on, because I felt there's something wrong with the monetary system. There's something wrong with printing money. And that's why I came across a YouTube video where Bitcoin was mentioned as sound money with a cap. That totally caught my interest.
Right.
And so the current situation in United States, I read an article, I think it's like a couple of months ago, where 70% of the households in United States, they have less than $10,000 to their name, which means, and it's something like half only has enough money to the next paycheck. So that means there's a lot of money in a situation where there's no room for error, and things can just go wrong. And you see so many homeless people as well. So I feel, I spoke to a guy a couple of days ago, and he said, yeah, this is because of the wrong political decisions. But there's been Republicans, there's been Democrats. Barack Obama was there for 8 years. This isn't fixed. I don't think this is political, wrong political decisions. I think it's a systemic problem, and that's why I find the things that you say interesting. And if you let me read the Wikipedia definition of anarcho-capitalism, then I really want to give you the word and tell us more about it. So the definition on Wikipedia is: anarcho-capitalism is a political philosophy and school of anarchist thought that advocates the elimination of centralized state dictum in favor of self-ownership, private property, and free markets. So that's the Wikipedia definition. Please, JW, take it away and tell it to layman so we understand more about how this works and how it will function, even though there's things that we believe today is necessary, but maybe they're not.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of different ways that I try to introduce people to the concept. I'll try two here. One is, if you believe that there is such thing as morality, part of that is private property, right? I can't hurt your body and I can't steal your stuff, is universal morality across all humans across the world. And the thing that you have to do in order to make room for the state, or make room for, say, coercive governments that take your stuff on a regular basis, but it's righteous and it's good because it's taxation, it's not theft, right? In order to make that work, you have to make a huge exception for government from a morality standpoint. So if I take your stuff from you regularly, that's theft. But if I'm a government, then I can take your stuff, quote, legitimately, right? I'm a legitimate government taking your stuff on a regular basis. So the way that magic happens varies, right? It depends. Sometimes I can, like in the case of certain kings of England, the current actual Queen of England is part of this line. What you had to do in order to become a legitimate government is get all of your thugs together and cross a body of water, kill a bunch of people, and then put them under subjugation. And then you were the legitimate king of that island, and you were able to tax the people. I don't really buy that one, right? So what are some other ones? Another is that maybe that wasn't legitimate, but once you get to the point of having representation, right? This was a mistake that I think I'll call them the founding fathers, even though I hate that idolatrous term, but our holy founding fathers in America, they made this error, or at least they pushed this error on the people, which I think is much more likely, and that is that it's legitimate if there's a vote, if there's some form of representation that takes place in Parliament, and then somebody comes and takes your stuff, then it's legitimate, right? It's fully legitimized, and I think that. If you think about this in simple terms, you can slowly build up to understanding how absurd this is. Like if, 10 people are at a bar and one of them says, hey, you have to pay my tab. Well, that's not legitimate. But if there's a vote, if 6 of the 10 people vote that you have to pay the tab for everybody, is that legitimate? Like, does voting, is that a religious ceremony or some kind of mystical activity that turns theft into taxation, right? Wrong into right. I don't buy any of those arguments. I think they're not hard to take apart, right? Another is that, well, these are the rules here, and if you want to leave, you can, right? You can opt out. So, yeah, it's unfortunate that when you were born, you weren't asked to sign a contract to enter into this agreement to be part of this let's say homeowners association sort of system where we take your stuff on a regular basis, but we provide you certain monopoly services. And that's unfortunate, but that's just the way the world is. So it's an opt-out situation. It's not an opt-in, right? You're defaulted in because you're born here. But hey, man, you can move and you can go anywhere you want in the world. There's no reason that you have to stay in the country that you're in. That's also kind of an absurd claim, because if I could opt out without having to have all of my property rights violated in the process, that would make sense, right? If I'm born into a family, right, I have certain, you could call them nature given or God given resources, because I have a social network in a geographic area that I'm born into called the family, and that's built out, with all of those other connections. And at some point I buy a piece of property and I own a car and I have, material possessions. And then you tell me, well, you can opt out, but you can't take you can't keep any of your stuff, right? Like we keep your land. You have to travel to a foreign place. You have to start completely over from scratch. Those are a lot of costs. And in the United States, actually, fortunately, the veneer of PR, I think, is getting stripped away faster and faster in America. One of the things that happened, I think it was about 10 years ago now, is that we stopped letting U.S. citizens just renounce their citizenship and leave with what they could cobble together. Obviously, you'd still have to sell your property and you'd have to leave all of your, possessions. You'd have to sell them before you left, used to be the thing. And that's very costly. And it's not like a voluntary agreement that you can opt out of, right? But we've even removed like that thin veneer of confusion, because now if you're an American citizen and you want to opt out, you want to renounce your citizenship and you want to become Danish, you have to give the government 25% of all your earthly possessions before you go. So now it's more obvious that you're really buying your own freedom, right? That you are a citizen slave and you have to pay in order to get out of this arrangement. And you have to just write a check. And if you do something like sell all of your possessions and then try to leave, well, that's illegal, right? You're not allowed to do that. You wouldn't be a free person if you did that. They'd still come after you. So that's one way, is just trying to point out that there is this moral exception that we apply only to governments, and it doesn't make any sense.
Right.
The other way that go ahead.
Yeah. I was just taking a note of what you said before. Of if you want to leave, you actually have to pay a tax. We all know that, but you have to pay a tax on what you have, and then you can leave, essentially. And the first thing I thought about when you said that is it sounds a lot like when a Roman slave bought his freedom.
Right.
Like you could actually, that's always been a concept that you could, as a slave, you can buy your freedom if you have enough money.
Right. Yep.
So
Yeah. I mean, these are
like
really,
that.
yeah. Yeah. I agree. And I think, you know, a lot of this stuff comes down to, like it is not hard to make this case, right? Like I can make the argument that governments are not, like, if you're wearing a funny hat, you don't immediately get rights to do things to your fellow humans that you don't have when you're not wearing the funny hat, right? Like as a police officer, if I decide that I don't like the plant you're smoking and I crack you upside the head and put handcuffs on you and then put you in a cage, that is completely moral and ethical and legitimate, right? But if I was a private citizen doing that, well, I don't have the magic, God ordained or whatever the current, more modern absurdity is, that justifies that activity, right? Like I can't beat you because I don't like the type of plant that you're smoking unless I have a funny hat, right? There's a lot of that.
Right.
So it's really easy to make this argument. Like this argument is probably the easiest philosophical argument that I've ever tried to make once I understood it. The only reason there's resistance to it is that we're indoctrinated from 4 years old or younger. And it is very, it's very sophisticated and very systematic to get us to a point where we feel like we're betraying our own homeland, right? Like we're betraying our homeland, or we're betraying our society, or we're betraying our fellow humans, unless we're willing to sacrifice our children on the altar of the state if they decide that they want to go to a war.
Right.
It's not something that is easily done, but over thousands of years, it's been well refined, and that's really what we're fighting against,
Right.
when we're trying to have this discussion.
How do you see then? Okay, so this is a little bit of like where it's coming from, but how do you see anarcho-capitalism actually work in practice? Like how would it function in terms of so I understand that there would be no tax whatsoever. Everyone would be buying their service, the different services that they want. Can you explain how do you see that actually working in practice?
Yeah, let me use the other way that I describe what anarcho-capitalism is as a concept, and that is to try to think about where governments originated from. So this is the sort of thing that like philosophers and economists try to do. They try to just think about human nature and think about the way the world works and try to construct a version of history that's logical. It's not necessarily accurate, but it's logical to help us understand what the different moving pieces are, right? So if you imagine, a couple generations after Cain and Abel, or a couple generations after we were monkeys, whatever your version of the origin story of man is, men were living in villages, right? Small communities. And one of the things that we know was a problem is roving bands of basically murderers, right? They would come into a village and they would just kill everybody, or kill almost everybody, and then take the stuff that was there. And that was, it's in some ways cost effective because the cost of defense was really high. You barely had the ability to scrape enough food to put in your belly. And if you could get a hold of the right weapons or skills or tactics, then you could go around and just rain hell down on, multiple villages, and that could just be a lifestyle. So we know that happened. And in a lot of ways, that's the sort of the simplest form of pulling wealth out of a group of people, right? It's not complicated. You just go crack their head and then you take whatever's left laying around, right? Well, historians, some historians believe that this is how it happened, but again, we're just trying to go through a logical progression of how we think this could have worked out. Because at some point there was a small number of us, right? We didn't have nation states until a very recent period of history. We had city states, still relatively recent period of history. So how did these things come about? Because it's not like we've always been here. So one of the theories, and I think that it's a pretty good one, is that after these roving bands would go around and kill people, at a certain point they realized that instead of going and killing everybody in the village, they could kill fewer people, and that would allow them to fleece these people regularly, right? So I'm going to come in every spring, and I'm going to, if you submit, great, because that's better for everybody, and I'm going to take your stuff. And if you give me your stuff, then I'll just keep going, right? And everybody is better off. And in actuality, everybody is better off in that circumstance than they were in the one before, especially if that roving band that comes and takes your stuff every spring also sort of has a territory, right? And protects you from other roving bands because they want to be the ones that fleece you. As the victim, you're actually, you benefit greatly from that. And that has all kinds of interesting consequences, including the fact that you would be wealthier as a society if somebody comes and takes your stuff every spring than if they just come in and kill you, periodically. Anybody settling in this region just gets slaughtered, and all those resources are wasted. It's a more efficient system. So as economists, we go, yeah, that makes sense. We like that sort of evolution because it checks all the boxes, and it matches human action, and it results in a more efficient sort of economic system. So we buy the idea that if that didn't specifically happen, it would have a tendency to happen. So then you think, okay, what would happen? What would be the next logical step? Well, at a certain point, you would expect that the folks that show up every spring would just stay, right? Like if you're willing to just submit to my authority and give me all your stuff every spring, why don't I just? But you've become my cattle, right? You've become my slave. You've become my property in a very real sense. Why don't I just set up and cultivate you as a people the same way that we evolved from being hunter-gatherers and just going out, and getting an elk to keeping sheep, right? You are my sheep in a sense, right? So why don't I just stay here, keep you, maybe keep you safer, maybe even, build a fort, a pen or something, right? To keep you more productive, whatever. And that is a very viable way of thinking about how governments came about, right? We don't have any evidence of people getting together and saying, you know what, there's 15 of us, but we really think only one guy should have guns, and we think that we should trust that guy to have a monopoly on violence. That's one of the theories to try to legitimize this whole arrangement, but it really, we have no historical evidence for that, and it really doesn't match human nature at all. So I think knowing where governments come from and helps you understand, or thinking logically about how these systems would have evolved, at least, if not understanding the history as well, helps you understand the nature of what we're talking about. And then when you're talking about solutions, you're talking about solutions to this problem. You're not talking about competing solutions, right? The fact that you are possessed and that you're a slave that is fleeced on a regular basis is not a solution to the problem of defense. It is the problem, and you haven't found a way to defend yourself yet.
Right. It all makes sense, and you can say that it may just be. I mean, it really seems logical that there is a natural tendency towards that going from this group of bad people coming and fleecing the city, which we know historically has happened, to actually being, okay, now there is a government in charge somehow, and fleeces people through tax, you can say. Although we have been told, of course, that we are getting value for that money, we're getting something back, but at the same time, we constantly see again and again and again not only every year, but pretty much every month, examples of corruption and campaign money being given. For instance, in US, which is actually legit corruption, you can say, by the law, and it just influences the way the system work, and it kind of is self-sustaining, this sort of government.
Yep, totally. And I mean, you can spend a lot of time looking at the different PR tools that have evolved to make this arrangement more sophisticated and more cost effective for the slave owners, right? Like the concept of a constitution, the concept of a parliament, the concept of democracy itself, or monarchy, or any of these things that in your mind you're going, well, what about this? Doesn't this make it legitimate? What about that? Doesn't that make it legitimate? Like, we could spend hours just trying to take each one and say, well, what about this magical piece of parchment that I never signed and that is clearly not followed in any way by the government? Because the first thing that happens in a constitutional democracy is you start violating the Constitution, right? And then you need another innovation, a bunch of guys in black muumuus to say, no, that is constitutional, right? You think that we don't have the right to do these things because we explicitly said that we only have the right to do certain things, and that's not on the list. But we actually do have the right to do that, and here's the legal justification for it, right? So there's all these PR tools that are used to more cost effectively than cracking you in a head with a bat, convince you to submit and to give over your stuff. But it's, rather than trying to, and everybody's going to have to do that, right? If you've been indoctrinated for 25 plus years from a state sponsored school system, you are going to have a lot of you're going to have a deprogramming period, right? You've been born into a cult. You've been indoctrinated very, very deeply into this cult. You're not going to be able to give up the flag and the Constitution and the Queen or whatever it is overnight. It's going to be a long, painful process of pulling out those idols from your heart and saying, no, these don't provide for me. These do not make theft right. They're not good. They're not righteous, and throwing them away. Right. But if you get the big picture first, that has to happen, right? If you kind of understand the basics, then the next 5+ years of your life, it's inevitable that you're going to be slowly pulling out these wicked little things. Right. But to answer your question of how it would work, so I'm a big fan of Murray Rothbard, and actually last night, as I was thinking about this, because I knew you were going to ask that particular question, and the question is, okay, great. So nation states, taxation, all of these things are not legitimate, but they're a reality. So how do we get to a place where we have freedom, where we don't have our stuff stolen from us? How do we solve the problem of personal defense? And a good way of asking that is, let's say that you woke up tomorrow in Ancapistan and there was no government, and you have some private defense systems in place. What do those systems do that prevent the United States or China from taking over your territory and subjugating you to slavery again? And in the past, I've answered that in ways that I don't feel is really satisfactory anymore, ways that Murray Rothbard answered it. And one of them is we have some ideas, right? We have some ideas about how private insurance works. It addresses all kinds of natural disaster situations, right? Like private insurance can cover you from getting hit by a hurricane, right? Certainly, there's no reason to believe that buying insurance and all the mechanisms that puts into place couldn't put you in a position to protect you from theft from either your neighbor or even a nation state, right? And I buy that to some degree. The other response is, look, we may not have all of these things figured out yet, and worst case scenario, you end up being a slave again, right? Yeah. So it's not a good argument to say, I don't buy into the idea of becoming free because it's possible that I will be subjugated to slavery again. That's the argument, and I think
Right.
that there's some truth to that angle as well. But as I was thinking about it, I think I have a much better way of thinking about it now and describing it, and that is, you're right. We don't have a solution to the problem of personal defense. So I don't I don't know how we would do that. I have some ideas of how we might be able to do that, but I have to sort of stare into the abyss and admit that as of this moment, there is no square piece of earth that is not owned by a nation state that free men can stand. And one possible solution to that, or explanation for that, is just like historical baggage. That, if 100 years ago the United States had not embraced the myth, or 200 years ago, the whatever it is, the myth of the holiness of voting, turning taxation, or turning theft into taxation, because you have representation, right, in parliament or whatever. Had they not bought into that idea, we would have had a free nation in the United States, or a free piece of land, and we would have evolved in a different way, and we would actually have the ability to experience freedom. Like, you can make that argument, and I think that maybe that's true, but it's pretty there's not a lot of evidence for that, right? And I think it's a lot more honest to just say, look, right now, we don't have the mechanisms, or we have never seen the mechanisms in play that make slavery unprofitable, and that's ultimately what we have to have happen, right? There's a lot of revenue that I can get if I can attack a group of people. If I can go into that village and say, hey, I'm going to be back every spring and I'm going to take your stuff, it's very profitable. There's costs associated with that, right? I have to have credible ability to kill you, right? And that's not cheap. That takes time to develop. But if that's profitable, if the math works out to where on average the attackers are going to be financially rewarded for that activity, we have to say, well, yeah, we're going to have a lot of that activity. And the only way that we should expect that activity to go away is if something changes that equation, so it's no longer profitable. And I don't think that as of this moment I can say with certainty that technology exists. And I do believe it's a technology solution, right? The free individual people will solve problems like cancer and like heart disease and these other things, and like personal defense over time. But we haven't solved those problems yet. And we should just admit that we don't have, it doesn't make it any more legitimate, right? Like, government is still a scourge and a disease, and it's not legitimate. But that doesn't mean that we have a way to destroy it, right? It doesn't mean that we have a way to create a free space where people can thrive without being slaves.
Right. While you were describing anarcho-capitalism, I was just thinking the two things. First of all, when was the last time that we essentially had it in practice on Earth? And I'm thinking that must be like early hunter-gatherers, before the size of that small group was big enough for one guy to be the leader, who started to tax the other people when they went hunting. If they just lived together, and shared the spoils of a good hunt, and when they found berries, etc., that's fairly a free society, it seems.
Yeah.
Then the other thing I was thinking is, maybe the most recent, and I may be totally wrong, but you mentioned Afghanistan, and I was actually thinking, I'm not talking about Taliban here, obviously, but Russia tried to come in and invade Afghanistan, and you had this tribal system, which is still there today, where you have all these tribes, and you can, of course, you can totally disagree with their view on women and how they should be treated, but they resisted successfully an invasion of a superior army, because they had the local knowledge, and they had they had their freedom to fight for against an army where the motivation was, let's go and seize some land. Those guys didn't want to die, but if you're fighting for your freedom, you're willing to fight until your death, highly likely.
Yeah, so guerrilla warfare is something that definitely creates an advantage when you're fighting against a more equipped army and a better funded army. The problem is that when you look at something like Afghanistan or the United States, to bring it a little closer home for most of the listeners, after the war is over, right? After you have used violence, and you've done it effectively, right? You've used punji sticks in Vietnam instead of massive tanks and just burning entire acres, right? You've been more efficient in your warfare. When all of that is over, you probably end up with a government that's worse than the one that you started with. It's not even like a 50-50 chance, right? So the folks in Afghanistan that are fighting against the Russians, had they lost, they probably would have ended up more wealthy, more prosperous, and better cared for slaves than had they won. And there's tons of examples of this. It's really kind of depressing. It's one of the things that I think people have a tendency to romanticize because it's just such an awful, sick reality. But look at what's gone on in Africa, right? I don't think that you could objectively say that those people that fought for freedom, and I believe they did in a lot of ways, they were possessed and they were mistreated and they suffered under colonization. But after they obtained their quote freedom, they ended up with a government that was worse than the one that they had before, right? And it's hard for me to think of any example, like even like who's the most holy and worshipped. I'll say guerrilla fighter, but he wasn't fighting, but essentially he was Gandhi, right? So everybody loves Gandhi. He was such a good guy. He used economic warfare instead of guerrilla tactics, right? He used the fact that the state relies on propaganda and PR and support of the people, just like any mafia. The mafias that operated in New York required support from the people just as much as any government, because it's just not cost effective to crack skulls after the Industrial Revolution. So he took advantage of the fact that they needed support, and he did things like he stopped buying salt, right? He manufactured salt. He encouraged all of the people to do that. So he went after their revenue streams in a really creative and cost-effective way. And I respect the hell out of that. But what happened as a result of that, right? Today than if they had remained under the subjection of the British Empire? I would have a tendency to think no, frankly. Now, I haven't spent a lot of time on that particular question, but I think that it's pretty obvious that more often than not, let's say, the people that obtain their freedom are poorer than before. And one of the ways that you can look at it is just overall taxation, right? So if you look at the amount of taxes that the average American was paying before the Revolutionary War and after, that would be a pretty good proxy to figure out whether they're more free, more prosperous, and better off than they would have been had they lost. I think more often than not, it's going to be very hard to say that you're better off having won that revolution.
Right, but isn't it also because that in Afghanistan, in India, and in Cuba, for instance, where Fidel Castro fought to overthrow a regime, then those places were not replaced with anarcho-capitalism. They were replaced with other taxation regimes. And the trick is to get to anarcho-capitalism, right? To make the argument, at least, to find out if it's better or not.
Well, I think logically, there's no question it's better, because all we're saying with anarcho-capitalism is people are not stealing your stuff, and they're not subjecting you to slavery, right? And There are some people, especially liberals, that will argue that human nature is so evil that it requires a yoke, right? Like we have to. If we had freedom, we would just be consuming each other. Violence would, reign, and all these terrible things. But most people don't buy that, right? Most people they have neighbors that they talk to, they have people they've interacted with over their lifetime, and they have a pretty good instinct that even if the inept police force wasn't there to mop up the blood, that these people are not going to try to harm them, right? That by and large, it's sort of a genetic abnormality to be somebody that's willing to cut somebody's throat to take their stuff. So most people don't buy the idea that it would just be absolute chaos, right? Like the idea that anarchy would be chaos. Anarchy is just absence of slavery, right? And the idea that that wouldn't be an organized, peaceful society isn't something that a lot of people buy when they think really, long and hard about it. But the question is not whether it's better, it's how do we get to that point, right? And like I said before, this is the first time that I have not given an answer that I think is somewhat weak. And I'm saying, look, I have some theories, right? And I think we should talk about how that might work. Because I have some theories of the tools and the technologies that are going to take us to a place where it is no longer cost effective to have human slavery. But just trading out the slave owner, which is what you do in a revolution, right? You get rid of one slave owner. Nothing has changed, right? It's still profitable to own and possess you as a people group. The only question is who's going to possess you and how are they going to treat you? That's not a good strategy, right? It hasn't worked out historically, and it doesn't seem like it would work out logically either.
Right. I want to throw one thing out there, and I know you have to go soon, and then hopefully we can do a part 2, because there seems to be a lot more to talk about later today, maybe in an hour or something like that. We'll see. But you mentioned the thing about insurance, that you can insure yourself against a foreign state invading. And I'm thinking, if the insurance company is then being paid, then maybe also they will have an interest in spending money on defending you, so they don't have to pay out the insurance premium. So
yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. No, I mean, you're building up the exact argument in your mind that Murray Rothbard presented, and that is that that you would buy insurance to $1,000 a month or $100 a month, whatever it is, and that the company would have an interest in protecting you. So they would basically have a private army, but they only need to defend you enough to make it not cost effective to attack you, right? They don't have to have nuclear bombs, for example. If you have an AR-15 and you know how to use it, and they have one, let's say, 3 soldiers that cover a 3 square mile area, and they know how to use mortars, maybe that's enough to make it no longer cost effective to want to possess this territory. So, I mean, and I think that you could make that argument, right? If I was setting up a private insurance company to defend a section of land, the first thing I would do is I would make sure that every person that I'm defending is as expensive to attack as possible, and that would mean a minimum amount of training and equipment, right? A couple $1,000s worth of hardware, couple weeks of training, and my risk of somebody trying to possess this chunk of land goes down drastically, right? Maybe to zero. We haven't seen that play out as a solution, and so my guess now is that there just haven't been the right tools to make that equation work out. But I think as a teaser for next time, I think Bitcoin and some other technologies that have only been around for less than a decade are going to cause that tipping point to happen. Just like the Industrial Revolution made racial slavery a thing of the past because it wasn't cost effective. It didn't make the attacker money. I think that these technologies now are in the hands of all of the citizen slaves around the world. And once they're fully adopted over the next 5 to 10 years, I think will simultaneously greatly decrease the revenue of owning a citizen slave and greatly increase the costs of owning a citizen slave. And so I think it's very possible in our lifetime we will see the end of human slavery, and I'm pretty excited about it.
Awesome, that would be great. So is that a teaser for the second show here a bit later today? Or?
Yep, exactly.
Awesome. Excellent. Looking forward to that very much, JW Weatherman. Thank you very much for part one of the show on anarcho-capitalism. I look forward to continue the conversation with you afterwards. So if you need to run now, you can run. I'll just round up the show, and then we'll launch again in an hour's time if we're not able to do it even before that, actually.
Awesome. All right. Talk to you soon. Thanks, man.
All right. Thanks. Bye. All right, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this part one, and I'm glad that JW is generous with his time and willing to do a part two. I think it's a very interesting topic. If you like interviews like this with people that are inspiring like JW, please hit subscribe. Potentially also hit the little bell button so you'll get a notification when I go live. Because I'm doing a mix on the channel of either I'm doing a video where I'm talking about a topic myself, or I am interviewing different people. I've had Vortex on, Adam Meister, now JW, and might be able to get Giacomo Succo, depending on his availability, on Monday, actually. So anyways, thank you so much for watching so far, and hope to see many of you again in, say, half an hour, 1 hour, something like that. Thanks, guys. Bye.